The Sinking of the Titanic and Other Great Sea Disasters, edited by Logan Marshall. Chapter 5. The Titanic Strikes an Iceberg. Tardy attention to warning responsible for accident. The danger not realized at first. An interrupted card game. Passengers joke among themselves. The real truth dawns. Panic on board. Wireless calls for help. Sunday night, the magnificent ocean liner was plunging through a comparatively placid sea, on the surface of which there was much mushy ice and here and there a number of comparatively harmless-looking floes. The night was clear and stars visible. First Officer William T. Murdoch was in charge of the bridge. The first intimation of the presence of the IceBerg that he received was from the lookout in the crow's nest. 3 warnings were transmitted from the crow's nest of the Titanic to the officer on the doomed steamship's bridge 15 minutes before she struck, according to Thomas Whiteley, a first saloon steward. Whiteley, who was whipped overboard from the ship by a rope while helping to lower a lifeboat, finally reported on the Carpathia aboard one of the boats that contained, he said, both the crow's nest lookouts. He heard a conversation between them, he asserted, in which they discussed the warnings given to the Titanic's bridge of the presence of the IceBerg. Whiteley did not know the names of either of the lookout men, and believed that they returned to England with the majority of the surviving members of the crew. I heard one of them say that at 11:15 o'clock, 15 minutes before the Titanic struck, he had reported to First Officer Murdoch on the bridge that he fancied he saw an iceberg, said Whiteley. Twice after that, the lookout said, he warned Murdoch that a berg was ahead. They were very indignant that no attention was paid to their warnings. Tardy attention to warning responsible for accident. Murdoch's tardy answering of a telephone call from the crow's nest is assigned by Whiteley as the cause of the disaster. When Murdoch answered the call, he received the information that the iceberg was due ahead. This information was imparted just a few seconds before the crash, and had the officer promptly answered the ring of the bell, it is probable that the accident could have been avoided, or at least been reduced by the lowered speed. The lookout saw a towering blue berg looming up in the sea path of the Titanic, and called the bridge on the ship's telephone. When, after the passing of those 2 or 3 fateful minutes, an officer on the bridge lifted the telephone receiver from its hook to answer the lookout, it was too late. The speeding liner, cleaving a calm sea under a star-studded sky, had reached the floating mountain of ice, which the theoretically unsinkable ship struck a crashing, if glancing, blow with her starboard bow. Murdoch paid with life. Had Murdoch, according to the account of the tragedy given by 2 of the Titanic seamen, known how imperative was that call from the lookout man, the men at the wheel of the liner might have swerved the great ship sufficiently to avoid the berg altogether. At the worst, the vessel would probably have struck the mass of ice with her stern. Murdoch, if the tale of the Titanic sailor be true, expiated his negligence by shooting himself within sight of all the alleged victims huddled in lifeboats or struggling in the icy seas. When at last the danger was realized, the great ship was so close upon the berg that it was practically impossible to avoid collision with it. Vain trial to clear berg. The first officer did what other startled and alert commanders would have done under similar circumstances. That is, he made an effort by going full speed ahead on the starboard propeller and reversing his port propeller, simultaneously throwing his helm over to make a rapid turn and clear the berg. The maneuver was not successful. He succeeded in saving his bows from crashing into the ice cliff, but nearly the entire length of the underbody of the great ship on the starboard side was ripped. The speed of the Titanic, estimated to be at least 21 knots, was so terrific that the knife-like edge of the iceberg spur protruding under the sea cut through her like a can opener. The Titanic was in 41.46 north latitude and 50.14 west longitude when she was struck, very near the spot on the wide Atlantic where the Carmania encountered a field of ice studded with great bergs on her voyage to New York, which ended on April 14th. It was really an ice pack, due to an unusually severe winter in the North Atlantic. No less than 25 bergs, some of great height, were counted. The shock was almost imperceptible. The first officer did not apparently realize that the great ship had received her death wound, and none of the passengers had the slightest suspicion that anything more than a usual minor sea accident had happened. Hundreds who had gone to their berths and were asleep were unawakened by the vibration. Bridge game not disturbed. To illustrate the placidity with which practically all men regarded the accident, it is related that the Pierre Marechal, son of the vice admiral of the French Navy, Lucien Smith, Paul Chevry, a French sculptor, and A.F. Ormont, a cotton broker, were in the Café Parisien playing bridge. The four calmly got up from the table, and after walking on deck and looking over the rail, returned to their game. One of them had left his cigar on the card table, and while the three others were gazing out on the sea, he remarked he couldn't afford to lose his smoke, returned for his cigar, and came out again. They remained only for a few moments on deck, and then resumed their game under the impression that the ship had stopped for reasons best known to the captain and not involving any danger to her. Later, in describing the scene that took place, M. Marechal, who was among the survivors, said, "When 3/4 of a mile away we stopped, the spectacle before our eyes was in its way magnificent. In a very calm sea, beneath a sky moonless, but sown with millions of stars, the enormous Titanic lay on the water, illuminated from the waterline to the boat deck. The bow was slowly sinking into the black water." The tendency of the whole ship's company, except the men in the engine department, who were made aware of the danger by the inrushing water, was to make light of, and in some instances even to ridicule the thought of danger so substantial a fabric. The captain on deck. When Captain Smith came from the chart room onto the bridge, his first words were, "Close the emergency doors." "They're already closed, sir," Mr. Murdock replied. "Send to the carpenter and tell him to sound the ship," was the next order. The message was sent to the carpenter, but the carpenter never came up to report. He was probably the first man on the ship to lose his life. The captain then looked at the communicator, which shows in what direction the ship is listing. He saw that she carried 5 degrees list to starboard. The ship was then rapidly settling forward. All the steam sirens were blowing. By the captain's orders, given in the next few minutes, the engines were put to work at pumping out the ship. Distress signals were sent by the Marconi, and rockets were sent up from the bridge by Quartermaster Rowe. All hands were ordered on deck. Passengers not alarmed. The blasting shriek of the sirens had not alarmed the great company of the Titanic, because such steam calls are an incident of travel in seas where fogs roll. Many had gone to bed, but the hour, 11:40 p.m., was not too late for the friendly contact of saloons and smoking rooms. It was Sunday night, and the ship's concert had ended, but there were many hundreds up and moving among the gay lights, and many on deck with their eyes strained toward the mysterious west, where home lay. And in one jarring, breath-sweeping moment, all of these, asleep or awake, were at the mercy of chance. Few among the more than 2,000 aboard could have had a thought of danger. The man who had stood up in the smoking room to say the Titanic was vulnerable, or that in a few minutes 2/3 of her people would be face to face with death, would have been considered a fool or a lunatic. No ship ever sailed the seas that gave her passengers more confidence, more cool security. Within a few minutes, stewards and other members of the crew were sent round to arouse people. Some utterly refused to get up. The stewards had almost to force the doors of the staterooms to make the somnolent appreciate their peril, and many of them, it is believed, were drowned like rats in a trap. Astor and wife strolled on deck. Colonel and Mrs. Astor were in their room and saw the ice vision flash by. They had not appreciably felt the gentle shock, and supposed that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. They were both dressed and came on deck leisurely. William T. Stead, the London journalist, wandered on deck for a few minutes, stopping to talk to Frank Millet. "What do they say is the trouble?" he asked. "Icebergs," was the brief reply. "Well," said Stead, "I guess it is nothing serious. I'm going back to my cabin to read." From end to end on the mighty boat officers were rushing about without much noise or confusion, but giving orders sharply. Captain Smith told the third officer to rush downstairs and see whether the water was coming in very fast. And, he added, take some armed guards along to see that the stokers and engineers stay at their posts. In 2 minutes the officer returned. "It looks pretty bad, sir," he said. "The water is rushing in and filling the bottom. The locks of the watertight compartments have been sprung by the shock." "Give the command for all passengers to be on deck with lifebelts on." Through the length and breadth of the boat, upstairs and downstairs, on all decks, the cry rang out, "All passengers on deck with life preservers." A sudden tremor of fear. For the first time there was a feeling of panic. Husbands sought for wives and children. Families gathered together. Many who were asleep hastily caught up their clothing and rushed on deck. A moment before, the men had been joking about the life belts, according to the story told by Mrs. Vera Dick of Calgary, Canada. "Try this one," one man said to her. "They're the very latest thing this season. Everybody's wearing them now." Another man suggested to a woman friend, who had a fox terrier in her arms, that she should put a life-saver on the dog. "It won't fit," the woman replied, laughing. "Make him carry it in his mouth," said the friend. Confusion among the immigrants. Below on the steerage deck there was intense confusion. About the time the officers on the first deck gave the order that all men should stand to one side and all women should go below to deck B, taking the children with them, a similar order was given to the steerage passengers. The women were ordered to the front, the men to the rear. Half a dozen healthy, husky immigrants pushed their way forward and tried to crowd into the first boat. "Stand back!" shouted the officers who were manning the boat. "The women come first." Shouting curses in various foreign languages, the immigrant men continued their pushing and tugging to climb into boats. Shots rang out. One big fellow fell over the railing into the water. Another dropped to the deck moaning. His jaw had been shot away. This was the story told by the bystanders afterward on the pier. One husky Italian told the rider on the pier that the way in which the men were shot down was horrible. His sympathy was with the men who were shot. They were only trying to save their lives, he said. Wireless operator died at his post. On board the Titanic, the wireless operator, with the lifebelt about his waist, was hitting the instrument that was sending out the CQD messages. "Struck on IceBerg, CQD." "Shall I tell Captain to turn back and help?" flashed a reply from the Carpathia. "Yes, old man," the Titanic wireless operator responded. "Guess we're sinking." An hour later, when the second wireless man came into the box-like room to tell his companion what the situation was, he found a Negro stoker creeping up behind the operator and saw him raise a knife over his head. He said afterwards, he was among those rescued, that he realized at once that the Negro intended to kill the operator in order to take his lifebelt from him. The second operator pulled out his revolver and shot the Negro dead. "What was the trouble?" asked the operator. "That Negro was going to kill you and steal your lifebelt," the second man replied. "Thanks, old man," said the operator. The second man went on deck to get some more information. He was just in time to jump overboard before the Titanic went down. The wireless operator and the body of the Negro who tried to steal his belt went down together. On the deck, where the first-class passengers were quartered, known as Deck A, there was none of the confusion that was taking place on the lower decks. The Titanic was standing without much rocking. The captain had given an order, and the band was playing.